Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to take a look at a script that will let you identify each input and title in a multi-box setup that you have in preview. This can be very useful for doing things like identifying the names of guests before you bring them live on air. So we'll get into that in a moment, but before we do, I want to invite everybody to please, if you have any questions, any feedback, just put them in the comments below and we'll get to them live here. Also, if you'd like to join us live on air, we have a link for you to copy and click on, and this would get you live on air with us to ask any questions or just to talk and give us some of your feedback and insights. So that would be great if you want to join us. So this was an interesting topic because it came from a friend of mine, Lee Love, who actually asked specifically about ways to identify the inputs associated with a multi-box shot in vMix. And this was something that I thought, first was like, oh, that's a cool idea. But then I said, this could actually be a very interesting show as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through how I have a session laid out to do this in vMix, and then go through the script that we set up to do this. And there are two flavors of this. The first will handle this for a multi-box that's assigned to preview. But the second will let you do this for a multi-box shot in program as well. And we'll just talk about what we needed to do differently to handle that situation. So if we switch over to our vMix interface here, essentially we have a couple of multi-boxes here. And what we want to give you the ability to do is to press a single button and see the names of the titles of the inputs associated with each of these multi-boxes and the number of the input that's associated with that. So this means if I go here, you can see these all line up with guest 1 to 5 here. Now, we've done the same thing with what we have available for program as well, but we'll go into that later. But this is basically what we're trying to cover here. So the basic model we have is that we have 6 guest inputs. So these could be any other types of inputs you wanted that could use labeling. We then have multi-box shots that are set up around that. So we have from 1 guest to a 6 guest multi-box. And then we have overlays that we've set up associated with each of these multi-box layouts. And what the script will do is it will identify what multi-box we have in preview. It'll identify the layers in that multi-box, and then it will pick the correct overlay and modify all the values for the names and numbers, the titles and numbers of the inputs in that overlay and display it. So why don't we dive into that since we're right at this point. So let me maximize this. All right. So we start out basically by defining all the variables we need. This is pretty much standard practice for how we develop scripts. So the first two things I take are the input that's in preview and the input that's in program. And there's a couple of reasons we take both of them in when we're just looking at the preview case here. The second thing we do is we set up all the things we need to handle which is the current overlay that we're working with, what's the current layer, all those inputs that we need. And then we use to set up the counters that we need for doing the loop through all the layers, which we'll do at the end. So as usual, we open up the vMix XML and we pull that in as an XML document. And now, once we have that all loaded, what we're going to do is we're going to pull out the active input that's in preview and the active input that's in program. And we do that by just doing select single node, and we're looking for this in the XML, the vMix preview. That's the node that we want, and we take the inner text. So this is something we've done before, and this is giving us a string with the preview input and the program inputs. So the first thing we do is we check to make sure the preview and the program inputs are not the same input. And that's very important because the way that we display the overlay in preview is as the topmost layer in a multi-view, in a layered vMix input. And if we did that and that layer was also in program, everybody out in the production world who's watching your show would also see that labeling. So we do that as just a check to make sure the two aren't there. And if that looks good and they're not, then we actually dive ahead. And as I said, we are assigning the inputs, the overlay we're using for the labeling the inputs, to the topmost layer. So the first thing we're going to do is let's shut that topmost layer off. So we set it to none and we hide it. So this basically makes it invisible. And then we're going to go through and one by one, we're going to sort of go through each of the layers in that. And to do that, we create a node list of all the layers. And if you remember in past videos when we talked about node lists, a node list is basically an array of XML nodes. And we're doing this by taking every XML node for the input inside of preview that is basically one of the layers that we have. So that's how we're doing this. We say, are these layers inside this input? Okay, let's go and grab all of those layers and create a node list with them. So once we have the node list, this means we have all the layers organized. We go in and say, well, how many layers do we have? And that's what the all layers node list dot count. The count is a property of a node list, and by doing that, we find the total number of layers. And what that's telling us is what are the total number of inputs in this multi-box. So with that, we just make sure it's not less than or equal to 0. And so, there are no layers because you could have something in preview that has no layers. And if that's the case, then we're just going to, get a couple of things lined up. The first is we want to find out what overlay do I need to use. So if this is a 3-box or a 5-box, I need to make sure I pick the correct overlay. And the way we set this up is that we named our overlays with very specific names. They all start with slot-ID, you see right here, and then the number of layers, the number of boxes in the multi-box. And so for that, we actually have that as total layers because that's what we just calculated up there with the layer count. And so now I am going to pick the overlay, in the case we had with the 5 layers, I'm going to pick the overlay that would have slot ID 5. And that would have all of the overlay inputs I'd need to cover the multi-box. And I will just, going through this, what I'm really going to do then is say, I just need to get everything lined up for each one of these. So as I'm going through this, the first thing I do is say, if there is no active overlay, so say I pick something which had 8 overlays and I only have 6 overlay inputs set up, then it'll just say, okay, let's get out of here. We can't do anything. But if everything looks good, then we're going to go and say, okay, now let's just go and grab everything we need to set this all up. And we're going to do that in a loop. So what my loop will do is I'll go and start at active layer 0 because it's a 0 base for how we count through this. And to the total number of layers, because it's 0 base, we subtract 1. So that's more of a programming efficiency thing. But all we're doing is we're going through each one of the layers in order with an index called active layer. And we're going to pull and get, because interestingly enough, in the layers that you have above an input, they don't give you the input number, but they give you the input key that's assigned to each one of those layers. So what we're doing is we're pulling that key, and then based on the key, we're asking for two pieces of information. We're doing the select single node for the input with that key, and we're pulling. Now, let me see if I can slide over here. We're pulling the number out of that, which is the input number associated with that input key. And we're doing the same thing, but we're also pulling the title out. So that's whatever that input has been named. And so that's all we basically do here inside this loop is we go through, let's go back here. We go through both of those. And then, if for any reason the input layer is nothing, it's an invalid value, we'll exit. But if there is something there, what we're going to do is we're going to go through and set up the text inside of the overlay layer that we picked for that. So if you remember, we did this, I believe, last week, where we're setting text inside a GT title designer that we have set up. So before we go into that, let me just open the GT title designer. So in this case, we were working on, let's see, I got that. Here, yep, so there we go. So this is the GT title designer that we have set up for the 6-box, but you'll just notice we have all of the inputs named on the side. And so this is the slot number and the name, and that's how we have this set up. So each one of these, that's the title of the input, and that's the slot number of the input. So inside my code, what I need to do is find the input number from the XML and assign that to this field in the GT title designer. And then I need to find the title of the input and assign that to this field, the name field. So the slot field gets the number, the name field gets the title. Okay, so let's jump back over here. And so this is exactly what we're doing here with the set text function. For the set text, we're taking and saying the value is the input number, the layer input number. The selected name is the slot, because this is what we're using now to assign the text to it. So to assign the right number to the text inside the GT title designer. So we say for slot number, in this case, because it starts at 1 and then goes up from there. And we are then just assigning the input, which is the active overlay. So now we've run through this where for each one of these layers, we're setting up the name and setting up the slot that they're in. And we go back and we continue looping until there are no more layers. So it's a very straightforward process. We're just pulling the numbers out and assigning them to the title. And when that's all done, we just go on and we sleep. One of the things we found is that somehow inside of vMix, you can run ahead of your title getting updated. So we just do a 200 millisecond sleep here to give the title a chance to be fully updated. And then we just go and turn the multi-view layer on at the top. So we have effectively taken and set everything up in a loop layer by layer. And that's all we're doing. So when we are going over to, let me get out of this. So we were in vMix and I pressed this button down. This is exactly what ended up happening. And that slight hesitancy you see is that 200 millisecond delay we have in there for what's going out, for making sure everything gets updated. So this is a fairly straightforward script, but it does require that things are set up correctly. The other thing to keep in mind is that even though I just made the decision to show the number and the title of each one of the inputs, you could certainly have other information there. If you remember in the past, we did something where I was showing whether guests were on air or off air. I was showing whether they were muted or unmuted. So you could have lots of different indicators here, or different indicators for different buttons. And the way we set this up is with a shortcut. Actually, we did it with two shortcuts. So if I come over here, if I want to label the preview, this shortcut basically just is a script start. So he's running the script. And we do the same thing for hiding this. We go in and we run the hide label script, which basically just shuts that top layer off. But the secret is we're using a Stream Deck, and when I do the find, so this is, let me just go in and show you what we do here. When I do find for the putting this on, I press the button down, and if you notice, when I press it down or release it, those are two different button signals. So that's considered two different indicators. So when I press the button down and click OK, I turn the labels on. But then when I want to go to shut them off, what I'm doing is I'm coming here, pressing the button on the Stream Deck, then releasing it. So this means that the Stream Deck now acts as a momentary switch. So when the button is pressed in and I keep my finger on it, the labels show up. And as soon as I release the button, then the labels go away. So this gives me that type of toggle capability by making sure we do things correctly with the assigning the key presses for up and for down. So before we get into talking about the how we do this on program, which is very similar, I just want to say we have Rudy has joined us. We also have Richard. So Richard, Rudy, thank you. And we also have, I'm going to try to, I think it's Nikolai. I'm sorry, or if I'm not getting the name correct, but thank you very much. I do appreciate you joining us and being part of the show here. So if we look at what we have for the program, this is almost identical, except for one thing. I can't put this into a layer, because if I use this in a layer, this would go out to everybody that's watching the show, because that's the program feed that's going out. So if I go here and I push this down, but I switch over to the actual program output, those labels aren't there. And so the way we're doing this is we are using an overlay, a traditional overlay, one of the 4 overlays. Let me sort of switch over here, get this up. So everything that we do is pretty much the same, but the overlays now are like the 1 to 4 that you'd put up all your lower thirds in. And everything, like I said, we're doing all of the things identically, except instead of working with the topmost layer, we now go and we just turn that as overlay 4, and we're using that, and we're saying, display this down here as the overlay. Everything else in preparation is identical. Instead of the preview, we identify the input for program, but the rest of the logic is completely the same. But the way we can get away with this, and this is something some of you may already know, is in your settings for outputs, you have the ability over here to say which inputs, which overlays do I want to allow on which outputs. So in this case, all I did was I turned off overlay 4 on my program output. And that allows me to see what's going on with on the display here, but not have that go out to any of the viewing audience. So it can be something where if you have that as a spare overlay, where you're just using like 1 and 2 for lower thirds and other types of graphics, this becomes an easy way to do this for your program as well. And because you are doing this with an overlay, you don't have to worry, like we did with when we did this in preview, of making sure that that the preview and the program aren't the same. There's none of those issues. There's an overlay, and that overlay never goes out of program. So very, very easy and straightforward to do. So there's a lot more I could have done with this that I didn't really get a chance to do this past week. But one of the things, if you notice, I did lay all of these overlays out with to sort of match up with the multi-box layout. But if I go over here, let me see if I open up here. So one of the things you'll see here is if we look at the input for, let's say, for the 2-box or the 3-box over here, in this XML, it actually describes the overlays that we're using for the multi-box. And it's telling us what their pan, oops, what their pan is and what their zoom is. So it would have been possible in the script to read these numbers and sort of center what I wanted to do just directly over each of these inputs without having anything really easily prepped in advance. That's what we had actually wanted to do, but there are, a lot of things that we couldn't do on the other side. So the biggest problem is we didn't have control over a way to do that inside of the GT Title Designer. I have no way to position an input dynamically, at least not that we were able to find. So we couldn't really do much research, beyond what we fit in this past week. But so that really limited our ability to leverage this information, though it is here. So hopefully at some point we'll have that control, because then all I'd need to do is just set up one overlay with 6 or however many fields I needed to have labels for, and we could use this information here as a way to position and sort of scale each one of the overlay inputs and label everything. But because we didn't have this and we couldn't figure out another way to do it, we actually just set them up all as individual overlays that we edited in GT Title Designer and selected based on the count of layers that we found. So that's really everything we wanted to cover with this. I think there are definitely different use cases that you have with this where you can, like I said, pull out different types of information and use that. There could be things, for instance, where you have slides from somebody and you need to have a way to see what slide they're up to. If you have that metadata somewhere and you can sort of count where they are, you could display things like that as an overlay here that you just pop on and off, not intended for the audience, simply intended as a production tool. And that's really what this is. This is another tool to give you that situational awareness. I know exactly what I'm looking at. I know exactly what to call people when I see them, and that can make a big difference for how comfortable you are when you're running a production. This could also be if you had live talent in a set. This could actually be a feed that you kept up, in a modified way with everybody's name on it all the time. So, anytime you change people in multi-boxes, you may want the new names so your host calls people correctly. So things like that, could be very useful. So general framework for doing potentially a lot of different things. And hopefully you're going to take and run with this and do things I haven't even thought of. So that would be great. So let's see. So we have Claudier. So yes, Claudier, thank you for joining us from Brazil. That is always great. And I do have to find out, you look like you're in a very luxurious powerboat there. I can't quite tell from the pictures at this distance, but it's either a powerboat or a glider of some kind. But very, very cool shot there. So we also have Leonotis. I guess I'm trying my best here. I'm sorry, I'm not great with names, but greetings from the U.S. Thank you for joining us all the way from Greece. That's definitely appreciated. So We will be hanging around for our post show where you can feel free to dive into this any more in any more detail you'd like, or talk about basically anything video production or streaming related. So uh, if I don't get to see you in the after show, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you for next week's show. Take care, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody, to the post show here. I just and I apologize because at my age and my eyes, I don't always get to see everything. But Gary also jumped in and commented about the programming. I think this is something, everything that you do that you want to be reusing and that you're going to be maintaining, giving yourself comments, giving yourself variable names that make sense. All of those things are really important when you do this. And I'll even make the point that for things that you think you're going to use once, you probably won't. So you're going to come back in a month from now and say, oh, do you remember that thing we were doing on this show? And you'll be pulling it up and using it. And we find that ourselves. For things we do here, we usually start with another script and go from there and modify it. It's just easier. So, oh, John, yes, hi, how are you? So, yeah, there is a lot that you can do when you start to identify what's in different inputs. Now you can start to build workflows that are really sculpted around different ways that you want to run a production, that you want to inform people and build a workflow. So I think that is the cool thing about what is provided in vMix, is that real low level. So so Rudy, there goes his weekend again. Yeah, that's I know how that feels sometimes. You just get a bug where you want to do something and you can't let it go. So absolutely understand that one. But so I think that's really one of the big advantages for all of these things that we're talking about. So they really break into things that either simplify the production, where you'd have more complex manual steps to do that you can work with automation for, or it provides better situational awareness, whether it's for the talent or for those operating things. And that's everything from who's muted, who's in which audio buses, what are people's names, all of those things sort of fit into that space. And as everyone who does things live knows, there are 1,000 little things that are going on all at the same time. And it's very, very easy to lose track and put somebody on but have them muted, things like that, where, having those extra checks, especially if they're automated checks. So for instance, if I had a button that would do the cut, I could make sure that when I cut everybody over, that all of them were unmuted. So, or anytime something goes into, I could have something that simply says, anytime I have a set of layered inputs inside of program, make sure I just unmute them automatically. So different types of things you can do that sort of are the belts and suspenders, where you just want to make sure I don't screw something up. But a lot of fun. I mean, these types of things, and each one of them is just a little puzzle that you sort of have to figure out how you'd like to do and piece it together. And the other thing that I found here is that there's a lot of stuff in vMix that's close, but they just don't give you enough information or enough of a control framework to work with. That was the point with the overlays. I can't position them. So if I have something set up, I don't have that next layer. I can change the values, but it's just working in the fixed template. And so for certain things, especially when you get into scripting, there's a lot more you'd like to really leave as generic as possible and configure just in time as I need to use something or put something up. So I want to make sure we open this up. So if there are any questions or any topics, streaming or production related, that people would like to talk about, please just share them in the comments. Also want to point out that we will still be taking guests live if you want to join us for the show. So you can just go to the Global Call-in Studio, Streaming Alchemy, and somebody from the team will get you on air and have you join us. But so uh, one of the other things that I mentioned at the beginning of the show was that this topic came from somebody, Lee Love, who has a great photo mentor. If you get a chance, watch it. Uh, it's about photography, but more than anything, it's about making the right aesthetic choices when you think of the photos or how you frame things. And it's definitely would be worthwhile. But he came to me and asked me specifically about this, and I think that's something for all of us as people ask us questions about can we do things. So, oh, Rudy, yep, there. Rudy's completely right. There is a lot of things that we do in life that you sit there and go, oh, I'll never need that, but then you go back to it, and it's like, oh, suddenly I need to support this, or I don't remember it. And that's also true even in non-programming things. I think if you build different vMix sessions for different clients or different productions, it is probably worth your while to create some sort of documentation about how this was planned out and the general workflow you anticipated for using this. So that's a very good point from Rudy. It is one of those things where you never think about coming back to something in a couple of months or even longer, and it is amazing when you have so much else you've done in the meantime how quickly you forget what the thinking was behind something you did in the past. So but I think we are going to get lots of suggestions from people that are going to ask us about, can you do this? How would you do that? And those things, even if we don't have answers right away, those are usually great things to explore because it's to a certain extent the marketplace nudging us to say, these are the types of things I'd like to be able to accomplish. And it kind of sets your mind in the right position for when an answer comes up. You can sort of sit there and marry the two. Oh, wow, this is a way to do this. It's a new release. It's a new feature. It's a new function that I can route through NDI. There's so many different options we have today. That's a great thing for us, where you're always trying to invent and innovate, both technically but as well creatively. So that's something I think is really important. So, any other questions? I want to make sure we keep that going. Uh, if we will be putting all of this up in the GitHub account we set up. So for every show we do publish all the scripts. I may also start just copying and pasting some of the scripts into the vMix scripting group that was set up. So I want to make sure that if people aren't going to GitHub, they at least get to see and play with some of the scripts here, and hopefully get some discussions going there on the live stream on the vMix scripting group as well, because that would be great. So if we don't have anything else, then I guess we're going to wrap it up for this week. I want to thank everybody for joining, everybody for participating as well. That makes the show a lot more interesting, I think, for everybody to get these different perspectives and just to know there are other people out there with you working on the same stuff. So until next week, then, everybody, thanks. Have a great week. See you next Friday.